In Sparta, when a baby was born, there were no embraces. There was a question: does this body serve? A council of elders examined it. If they found weakness, a twisted leg, a weak cry, any sign of frailty, the baby was taken to the mountains that same night. And it didn't come back. They didn't hide it. They didn't deny it. It was law. But this didn't start at birth, it started before, in the decision of who could have children, in arranged marriages, not for love, but for genetics, in a system that turned the bed into a laboratory. Sparta didn't raise families, it designed warriors, and to achieve that, it had to control something very personal: human reproduction. Today we know a lot about the Spartans, their battles, their discipline, the legendary agoge, where 7-year-old boys were transformed into war machines. But there's a part of the story almost nobody tells, the part that comes before, the brutal decisions that made everything else possible. Because to understand how Sparta created the perfect warrior, first you have to understand something uncomfortable. They treated human beings as raw material, and it worked for centuries, until it didn't anymore. This examination goes deeper than most accounts of Sparta. If you want to see history told this way, systems exposed, not just glorified, hit the like button and subscribe now. Let's begin at the beginning. Let's start at the beginning. The baby is 48 hours old. Its mother hasn't named it yet. Because in Sparta, names waited. They waited to see if the baby passed the test. To understand why, you need to know something about Sparta that doesn't appear in the movies. They were few, terribly few. At their peak, there were approximately 8,000 full Spartan citizens. They called them Spartiates. Facing them, 150,000 helots, enslaved, most of them descendants of conquered Messenians, entire peoples who remembered having been free. Do the math. Each adult Spartan had to control 19 people who hated him. Revolts weren't a possibility. They were a certainty. Violent, constant, existential. Sparta didn't have the luxury of weak citizens. Everybody had to count. And that counting started on the day of birth. The baby was brought before the Gerousia, a council of 28 men over 60 years old, plus Sparta's 2 kings. They weren't doctors, they were war veterans, men who had killed, who had watched their companions die, who knew exactly what kind of body survives in battle. The inspection didn't take long. Legs, straight. Solid bone structure, spine. Any curvature? Chest, well-formed ribcage, the cry, strong lungs. One of the elders would lift the baby toward the light. Turn it, press its chest to provoke crying. Observe the response. Sometimes the defect was obvious, a malformed limb, clear signs of illness. But other times it was subtler, a cry that sounded weak, skin that seemed too pale, something indefinable that the elder, with decades of experience, simply noticed. If it passed, the baby returned to its mother. For now, if it failed, it was wrapped in cloth. A soldier carried it that same night toward the slopes of Mount Tegetus. There's a place there. The Greeks called it apothetai. The deposits, rocks, wind, night cold. The soldier left the baby and descended alone. Infant exposure existed throughout the ancient world. In Athens, in Rome, in Carthage. But there was a difference. In those cities, it was a family decision. Private. Usually economic desperation. In Sparta, it was state policy. Mandatory. Systematic. It wasn't tragedy. It was protocol. But this was only the first filter. Because for the babies who passed, the control was just beginning. The Spartan state didn't wait until you were born to control you. It controlled you before, when your parents met, when they married, when they conceived. Every step was by design. In Sparta, you didn't choose who you married. State magistrates evaluated young people as if they were breeding livestock, and in a sense they were. Him, tall, broad shoulders, father and grandfather war veterans, no known family history of disease. Her, wide hips, robust constitution, capable of physical training without injury. Healthy lineage. Beauty mattered, but not as decoration. It mattered as a signal of health. Complete teeth meant good childhood nutrition. Clear skin meant absence of disease. Facial symmetry meant development without complications. The elders weren't looking for compatibility, they were looking for probability of strong offspring. And once decided, the couple was informed. Not consulted, informed. Love wasn't part of the equation. Love was irrelevant. Some Spartans, it's true, developed affection for their assigned partners. It happens, even in systems designed to prevent it. But that affection was accidental. It wasn't the goal. The goal was production, and the system went further. If a Spartan man was considered genetically superior, a decorated warrior, exceptional constitution, but his wife couldn't conceive, the state allowed, even encouraged, that man to have children with another man's wife. It wasn't adultery, it was civic service. Plutarch, the Greek historian, documents specific cases. An older man with a young fertile wife would allow a young warrior to impregnate her. The resulting child was considered an honour to both families. The husband felt no jealousy, he felt pride. His household had contributed a future soldier to the state. And the woman, well, her opinion doesn't appear in the records. This wasn't sexual freedom, it wasn't free love, it was eugenics. The word didn't exist yet. It wouldn't be coined until centuries later, but the practice was exactly that. Intentional selection of human characteristics considered desirable. And it worked. The Roman idea of pater familias, the father, as absolute authority of the household, didn't exist in Sparta in the same way, because the body didn't belong to the father, not even to the person themselves. It belonged to Sparta. This was explicit, legal, cultural. Men lived in communal barracks from age 7 to 30. Even after marrying at 20, they didn't live with their wives. Marriage was an arrangement for procreation, not for cohabitation. Men would sneak away from the barracks at night, briefly visit their wives, and return before dawn. Some fathers knew their children only through scheduled visits. The nuclear family didn't exist, only the state existed. And so, generation after generation, Sparta produced physically superior children. Children who, at 7 years old, would be torn from the little they knew as family, and delivered to something much worse. The boy is now 7 years old. He's lived with his family these past years. He's known a mother's warmth, play with other children, meals at home. But today, all of that ends. This morning, his mother dressed him in silence. She didn't cry, she couldn't. In Sparta, mothers who cried for their sons were considered weak, and weakness wasn't tolerated. She took him to the central plaza. Other boys his age waited there, maybe 50, maybe 60, all with the same expression, barely contained fear. A man approaches, tall scars crossing his face, an agoge instructor. He doesn't speak to the boy. He grabs his arm and pulls him toward the group. The mother stands there, motionless. She won't see him live in her house again. Not for 23 years, if he survives. Because the agoge wasn't a school. It was a machine designed to break children and rebuild them as something completely different. And it started that same night. The first lesson of the agoge was simple and merciless. Comfort is the enemy. The Spartan boy slept on a bed he had to make himself. Reeds torn by hand from the banks of the Eurotas River. No knife allowed. His only clothing was a single rough tunic, the same garment for burning summers and freezing winters. And above everything else, he was always hungry. The rations were intentionally meagre, a slow starvation planned with mathematical precision. But this deprivation wasn't just cruelty, it was strategy. The boys were ordered to make up the difference on their own, through theft. In Sparta, stealing wasn't a vice, it was a lesson. It honed stealth, patience, and daring. A warrior who couldn't slip unseen into an enemy camp and steal food was worthless. So the boys learned to move like shadows through their own city, scavenging for scraps. But if you were caught, the punishment was merciless. You'd be flogged without pity, not for stealing but for being foolish enough to get caught. The sin wasn't theft, it was incompetence. The message cut deep. Success justifies everything. Failure has no excuse. On the battlefield, being caught meant death, not just for you but for everyone beside you. The Agogi made sure that lesson was branded into flesh. This wasn't simply training soldiers, it was manufacturing predators. Cold, sharp, calculating, stripped of ordinary morality. In their world, right and wrong dissolved into one question. Did you succeed or not? They learned to lie, to vanish, to read weakness, and to obey without hesitation. They were brothers, yes, but brothers bound by pain, rivalry and fear. Starvation and theft were only the opening chapters. The next lessons were far darker. The human body adapts quickly to hunger, cold and blows. But the real war of the Agoge was waged inside the skull. Sparta didn't just need muscle, it needed minds honed like blades, spirits emptied of self, loyal only to the state. Having conquered the body, the instructors now targeted the soul. Their weapon, silence. Our word laconic, meaning brief in speech, comes from Laconia, the region of Sparta. That's no coincidence. Spartan children were taught that words were tools, not toys. Speaking idly, making a foolish remark, or asking a pointless question was punishable. Teachers hurled questions meant to provoke sharp, precise answers. Hesitation or dullness was met not with words but with pain. Sometimes the instructor would bite the offender's thumb, a small but unforgettable lesson in thinking before speaking. Silence became armor. Every word had to strike like an arrow. But the worst cruelty didn't always come from their elders. It came from each other. Older boys ruled the younger like tyrants, commanders, jailers, tormentors in one. At meals, they launched verbal ambushes. Who is the bravest man in Sparta? What do you think of the king's last campaign? Is theft honourable? There were no right answers, only traps. A stumble, a pause, the wrong tone. All invited ridicule or blows. Humiliation was public, constant, and deliberate. This wasn't random bullying. It was institutionalized cruelty, a state-designed system to forge minds that could stay cold under interrogation or chaos. Rivalry was fuel. Aggression earned respect. Trust no one. Expose others' weaknesses. Hide your own. These were commandments. All this daily brutality led to one of the most horrifying rituals of all, the ceremony at the altar of Artemis Orthia. Cheeses were placed upon her altar. The boys' task was simple, in theory. Run, seize them, escape. But to reach the altar, they had to sprint through a gauntlet of whips. Leather lashes sliced through the air, tearing flesh with every step. It wasn't a contest of speed or reflexes. It was a test of one thing alone: how much agony a future Spartan could endure without breaking. The true test was never about stealing cheese. It was about standing silent under the whip, enduring agony without a scream, a tear, or the faintest sign of weakness. To cry out was to disgrace yourself. Plutarch himself described young Spartans dying at the altar, smiling as their lifeblood soaked the ground. Dying proud, having proven they were worthy. This was their graduation, a baptism by blood meant to purge every trace of fear and softness. But when a society burns away every weakness, what fragments of humanity are left behind? What remains of the soul after it's been hammered into a weapon? If you're finding this examination of history's darkest systems valuable, consider subscribing. There's much more to explore about how societies shaped and destroyed human lives. What Sparta created was a paradox. Men of unmatched strength, yet emotionally hollow. Warriors of flawless discipline, yet warped morality. In their world, killing could be honourable. Compassion could destroy you. They were perfect instruments of violence. And now the state demanded proof that they could serve its darkest needs. That proof came through something few dared to even mention: the Crypteia. It wasn't a traditional military unit. It didn't fight in formation. It was something far more sinister, a covert death squad, a machine of fear designed to keep Sparta's internal enemies silent. To understand it, you have to grasp Sparta's greatest obsession: control. A small warrior class ruled over an immense population of enslaved helots who outnumbered them many times over. The Spartans lived with constant terror of revolt. Their answer was terror, calculated and preemptive. Each year, a select group of elite graduates from the Agoge, the strongest, most cunning, utterly ruthless, were sent into the countryside with only a dagger and a few scraps of food. They were ordered to hide by day, move by night, and kill without hesitation. Their prey, the helots, but not all helots, only the boldest, the most capable, those who dared to rise above the rest. These young men became the scythe that cut down any stalk taller than the field. This was their final exam, their last transformation. To murder an unarmed man under cover of darkness wasn't combat. It was psychological surgery, a brutal ritual meant to prove that mercy had been completely erased from their hearts. They were no longer killing out of rage or defense. They killed because the state told them it was necessary. And to make it all legal, the Spartan government performed a chilling ritual of its own. Each year, the Ephors, Sparta's ruling magistrates, formally declared war on the helots. It was a bureaucratic act with monstrous implications. Once declared enemies, helots could be slaughtered without it counting as murder. The killers of the Krypteia weren't criminals. They were soldiers carrying out the will of the state, a convenient fiction that turned mass murder into civic duty. By the time his dagger was stained with blood, the Spartan had completed his transformation. He had been born as a child of the state, shaped by discipline, stripped of emotion, and now proven capable of killing without hesitation. But what had he become? The defender of civilization? Or its most efficient predator? The answer, perhaps, is both, and that's what makes Sparta so disturbing. For 3 centuries, the machine worked flawlessly. Sparta dominated Greece. Its warriors were unmatched. Its discipline was legendary. But the flaw that would destroy it wasn't foreign. It was bred into the system itself. The first poison was demographic collapse. Sparta's ruthless eugenics, the abandonment of weak infants, the rejection of all imperfection, created a narrow gene pool. Every warrior lost in battle was an irreplaceable tragedy, the loss of decades of training and a carefully preserved bloodline. Other cities could raise new armies. Sparta could not replace 100 of its equals. Their greatest strength, their elite exclusivity, became their fatal weakness. They were breeding themselves out of existence. The second poison was inflexibility. The Agoge created impeccable soldiers, but not thinkers. Sparta produced warriors who could follow orders flawlessly, but not innovate, not question. As warfare evolved, their rigid system remained frozen. They were perfect soldiers, trapped in a world that demanded generals, and the final blow came with success itself. When Sparta triumphed over Athens, Persian gold poured into their city. Wealth, the very thing they had forbidden, corroded their iron discipline. The spirit of Sparta, built on equality and simplicity, began to rot from within. Then came Leuctra. In 371 BC, Theban general Epaminondas shattered centuries of Spartan invincibility. Instead of spreading his forces thin, he concentrated his left wing, 50 men deep, and rammed it straight into the Spartan right, where the king and his royal guard stood. Innovation crushed rigidity. For the first time in living memory, a Spartan king fell in battle. His army was annihilated beside him. Sparta's power was broken. By the Roman era, Sparta had become little more than a curiosity, a living museum where travellers came to watch reenactments of its brutal customs, echoes of a once great civilization. In the end, the tale of Spartan breeding practices is more than history. It's a warning, a society so obsessed with perfection that it sacrificed everything human to achieve it. They succeeded in creating the perfect warrior, and in doing so, sealed their own extinction. The machine that forged heroes eventually consumed itself, leaving behind nothing but ruins and the whisper of a greatness built on cruelty and undone by its own perfection.